Good to meet you, Michael.
Great to see you too, Pablo.
So when we talk about blockchain technology, which industry is currently leading in blockchain?
It's difficult to say which industries are particularly leading, but I think there is a distinction to be made between those industries that are deploying applications and those industries that are still doing proof of concept. So I think if you were to look, for example, within the banking sector, you'll see large numbers of announcements, tremendous numbers of demonstrators, proofs of concepts and use cases. But I would point you to other areas which are using distributed ledgers in earnest. For example, we have here a live distributed ledger doing medical applications, and this is doing about 60,000 transactions a day and has been doing it for a few years. So it's not new in that sector, and it therefore seems to avoid the hype of those of us who are perhaps sometimes too embedded in financial services. Another good example would be we have the government of Alderney, the States of Alderney, and they set up 2 years ago a government time-stamping service for all their official documentation. And again, this doesn't get the press of everybody out there, but it's a very functional, well-running application. And finally, even within financial services, I would argue that at least I know of 8 insurers who use blockchains in earnest. I know there are many other groups out there talking about forming consortium of insurers, but actually there are insurers who already use the technology today.
So what are the major benefits of blockchain technology for insurers?
We tend to use the term mutual distributed ledger. We do that for 2 reasons. I think the first reason is that we're pernickety and that these mutual distributed ledgers predate blockchain by some 15, 20 years. But the second reason is it describes what it does. I mean, a blockchain is a technical term, but a mutual distributed ledger is a use. And so the ledger is immutable. It is distributed around, and that the advantages of distribution are, as we all know, resilience, but also, of course, the idea that people can keep their own copies of the data. And then mutual, well, nobody owns it, or everybody owns it in common. It depends on how you define that. And so for me, it's not the technology, which is arguably no cheaper, smaller, or faster than a traditional central database. What's really, really important about the technology is what it does to power structures, and it avoids the central third-party problem that has bedeviled, I think, financial services for, well, probably for over 10 millennia.
When we talk about distributed ledger, someone still has to make the entries into the database. How does it work?
Well, if you have a distributed ledger, there are really 3 things that a central third party does. A central third party keeps a record of the transactions. The ledger, it just keeps it. So it may be the case that people are writing randomly into the ledger, but it keeps that authoritative copy. The second thing is that the party is there to safeguard the ledger, that the entries that go on to the ledger are sensible. But the third thing that they do is they establish sort of a consensus about agreements. Now, there are a number of different ways of doing that. So if we kind of look at it as kind of writing a transaction, safeguarding and preservation as the 3 areas, the technology can take care of the safeguarding and the preservation. That's what they are, nice, long, highly connected data structures. But there are numerous ways that one can add transactions to the ledger. So we can start with something like almost free-for-all. Think about a book at a party. Anybody can sign the book. Is there anything wrong with that? It's certainly a record of the people at the party who wanted to sign the book. Well, hang on a minute, the people at the party have all agreed to insure each other for £1,000. Oh, well, that's a different affair. So there are different types of confirmation mechanisms that you want to use for different purposes.
When you talk about changing of power structure, will it also affect the existing businesses, like big guys, monopolies?
Yeah. For me, the key concept, this idea of changing of power structures, it makes central third parties weaker. But there are some interesting side effects of that. The printing press, made scribes weaker, but we actually saw more books. So I expect to see many more third-party situations because the technology is removing barriers to entry. Well, that leads, I think, to some interesting issues with existing suppliers. People have said in financial services, this is the death knell of SWIFT, of DTCC, of any clearing house, of any exchange, of any custodian. I'm afraid I don't believe that for several reasons, but probably the 2 prominent ones are they already exist. and therefore they are cheaper, smaller, and faster than this distributed ledger solution. Because all of this consensus, all of this distributed data comes with a cost, a technology and an energy cost to it that is higher than existing systems. So I believe most of these ledgers will be deployed in new areas. Those new areas may be immediately on the fringe, but they will be new. And I'll give you a simple example. If you look at all the discussion about share trading, there are two areas that we've had difficulties with. One has been trade reporting to the regulators, so-called RegTech. And typically the way that this has been handled is to hand a natural third-party monopoly to one of the larger information services providers. Take a Bloomberg or a Thomson Reuters or a Market, somebody like that. Another area is legal entity identifiers. The industry has been struggling with those for years because it didn't want to have a central repository where somebody had too much control. Now both of those could transform financial services, but it would leave the existing central third-party providers alone for the moment, or perhaps for several years.
So if you have to imagine one blockchain application, what killer application would you imagine?
I think blockchain does struggle by not having an obvious killer application. Many of the central third-party problems we've had over the years we solved, and I do mean over the millennia. So we have got the Sumerians with clay tablets, we've got papyri, we have ledgers made out of tally sticks and wood. Then we move into the ledger book, and then we move into the database. And so these are really, if you think about it, just multi-organizational databases with a super audit trail. That's what makes them a ledger, a multi-organizational database with this super audit trail. So as you look at that, what's a killer application? What was I lacking that I didn't have before? Well, I would argue there are probably two areas, and I'm afraid in both cases they're sort of obvious and dull. One, I think, is an identity. These ledgers allow you to securely transmit documentation that has been digitally signed and sealed, and it allows you to do it in a controlled manner. I hasten to add this is the mutual distributed ledger in conjunction with sprites, as we call them here at Zien, or smart contracts, as the terminology seems to be evolving, which are basically pieces of code also embedded in the ledger. So it's not just the ledger itself; it's also the ability to embed inviolate code in it. Okay, so I think identity is one. And I think the second area, and I know you have interest in trade finance and things of that nature, is actually just the huge amount of documentation swapping that goes around. So I think if you look at the old workflow type systems, we used to have very complicated messaging structures. I send you the document, you approve the document, you send it to him. He's supposed to send it back to you, and you're supposed to send me a copy, but you forget to send me a copy, and we just have this huge mash of stuff. But there are industries where that's a very, very onerous and expensive process. And I can give you two just off the top of my head. One is shipping, and the other is insurance. Now, the funny bit is the banking and payments community come in and say, we can make your payments a lot cheaper. And I go, well, that's really sweet. Okay, how much cheaper are you going to make it? Well, we're going to take your SWIFT payment from $10 to $1. Great, so you've saved me $9. Do you know how many documents I need to write and retrieve and message just to move a ship or to handle a major commercial insurance policy? In the case of a ship, I've got a few hundred documents whizzing around between tens of players all getting altered. And on the insurance side, I can have thousands of documents without any question going around, perhaps 10 to 20 people, risk adjusters, claims, underwriters, broker, legal agents, client subsidiaries. There's quite a bit of stuff moving around here. And you're going to reduce the premium payment or the claim payment by $9. Thank you. But my costs are in the, make a number up, $20 to $50 per document in terms of just staff time. You send it, you read it, you check it, you send it. What we're doing now is we're moving all that into one database where everybody has the same view. And the messaging kind of goes, so all that messaging and the confusion in the messaging, it's still there because we're clearly doing technical messaging, but from a user perspective, all that messaging complexity has disappeared, and that's where the savings are going to be. So killer applications, identity, and large quantities of documents need to be swapped commercially.
I know that you did some work with land titles and property registers on the blockchain and distributed ledger. Can we guide through what are the problems with that project and what stage is it at the moment?
Yes, identity and titles, again, fall into that lovely category of people needing to swap secure documents with each other. We've been working in a variety of areas. They've ranged from fishery certificates to forestry certificates to gold certificates and kind of physical property movement, metals exchanges, so that's kind of one area of it. The second area is land and property titles. In both cases, the projects have moved forward. In land and property, it's pretty much been stymied because there's a big hump that has to be gone over. And I think that goes back to my point. If somebody already has a system in place, it's very hard to displace it. For many years, I used to run a fairly sizable chunk of UK government R&D, and one of the things I've always had was this ivy theory of technology. Technology rarely, punches through and takes something out. It's more like ivy. It kind of grows around the tree, and 20 years later you say, wow, that's a really strong tree, but where's the tree? It's gone. And I think that ivy theory applies in many cases here. So in the land registry, there's a big hurdle to be jumped over. And the project it's up to the government involved to decide if it wishes to do it or not. There's not much I can do. And it is a big risky decision for them, and so I respect what they're up to. Meanwhile, over on some of the certificates in the chain of custody area, another area rife with lots and lots of documentation, and it ranges in all sorts of ways. Genuine business benefit. It's not trying to displace something that's already there. It's trying to make something that's already there better. So I think it's more likely than a government-based property title. Government-based property titles will probably move to distributed ledgers over time, but they'll be at the end of the queue rather than at the front.
So do you believe that blockchain is a truly revolutionary and disruptive technology, or is it just evolution of what we had in the past?
That's a good question. Well, we built our first blockchain arguably in 1995, the idea of building an immutable ledger distributed peer-to-peer across multiple machines. It wasn't built quite the way that the blockchain adherents do, but certainly actually numbers of firms are moving in our direction and realizing the type of architecture we had is actually the higher economic performance architecture. So is it technologically revolutionary? Well, not really if it's 22 years old. So I'm not claiming that. And in fact, I think, because I happen to be a believer in simultaneous invention, I know a few other people around that time had also done some other projects, maybe a year or two later, but I'm not trying to claim we invented. I'm just saying people faced with similar problems come up with similar solutions. But we're now seeing 2 decades on the solutions starting to be adopted. Does that make them revolutionary? Yes, it does in a way, and I think it's because of 2 things. The first is, for better or worse, the world has come to realize that distributed computer systems are not dangerous, or let me be more accurate, are not any more dangerous than centralized ones. So we've seen lots of hacking escapades where people have gotten into a centralized database and reached everything. It's a bit funny, this, because if you go back to the origins of the internet, circa '69, it was the same issue. Why did I want to have this distributed network? So I had a distributed network because it was more resilient in the event of a nuclear attack. So these are probably more resilient systems, and the change there has been in attitude. And then I think, for me, taking both of those on board, and so it's no different than we could have automated airline tickets to the user back in 1960. It was possible. It's the pervasive element of everything in technology today. I can count on people having mobile phones to handle identity systems. I can count on people being connected to the internet. I can count on all that. So that's the critical mass bit. But the real transition is going to be to those central third parties. It's going to be the ability to create a central third party who is less able to abuse a natural monopoly, and that is the big revolution. Sounds economic, sounds boring, sounds quasi-illegal, but that's where it's going to hurt.
When we talk about development of new blockchain systems, distributed ledgers, do you believe that it should be technologically driven, or we should engage in multi-stakeholder talks about what we should build and how we're going to build it?
I think there's 2 parts to the question. The first is the evolution of blockchain over? Do we now have a defined technology? I would argue no. I think there's a lot more work yet to be done on exploring the range of potential architectures. People who think that the Bitcoin architecture is right clearly are wrong, or Ethereum or whatever. There's a long way to go, and those systems may well evolve that way as well. And the principal reason is the economics matter. the per transaction costs of a write transaction on Bitcoin or Ethereum is outrageous when compared to a traditional database. So that has to be overcome. In our firm, we believe some of the architectures we've developed have long ago overcome that, but I can see a number of other players are waking up to it. It's one thing to do a proof of concept, but you've also got to make it economically viable. So that's to me is the big evolution on the technology side. I think the technology side needs to evolve, and that's probably done, as most technological evolution is done, not in large teams. Having managed 14,000 scientists and engineers, the one thing you spend your time doing is getting small teams together. I'm famous for an argument, which I won't go into, that no more than 3 people ever really were at the core of any major systems design, but that's another story. On the do I need to work with other people, though, yes. This technology is fundamentally different. If it's a multi-organizational database with a super audit trail, well, there's no point in building it for myself. I need to build it in conjunction with other people. And in fact, I think in some ways that explains why mutual distributed ledger projects are more difficult. One, the databases are more complex, but let's not over-egg that. Call it an order of magnitude more difficult, 10 times. They're not outrageously more complex. But also remember, most organizations find it extremely difficult to implement a simple database. So we've got that. So that's a technological problem. But then anybody who's worked on a multi-organizational project knows the problems there. And so both of those things make these projects large and complex. I think finally, one of the interesting points to me about evolution, and I'm constantly saying to clients, you shouldn't be trying to find the one true distributed ledger. You shouldn't be trying to find the one true consortium. You should be shopping, not buying. You should be learning, not trying to dictate. Those are, I think, all important types of principles. But they're even more important here because the ledger is supposed to be immutable. So I would like to build something that's going to last not even 100 years perhaps, but 1,000. That's the intention behind these. So wouldn't it be very smart to do a lot of practicing and experimentation up front before you rock on with implementing something? And I think that experimentation phase is one that people who are thinking about the technology in the old style, they're trying to do things like, how do I get the advantage for myself and patent it? Well, that's silly because it's a multi-organizational thing. How can I ensure that I get this thing to market faster? Well, that's not the be-all and the end-all. And then they should be thinking about things like, how am I going to change it? How am I going to govern changes to the system? These things need thinking through. Technology itself is pretty flexible.
When we talk about blockchain development, do you believe in collaboration or competition? What is your approach?
We are very, very much of the collaborative school. Very, very much of the collaborative school. I think some people who look at our sites will say we should probably spend a bit more time on open source and other things, which we intend to do. But it's really just we're moving so fast, we often don't kind of clean things up and make them really easy for somebody to download. But we are moving that route. I think it's going to be very difficult to be closed school on this. It is, again, multi-organizational databases, so that is, I think, important. So I think it's an excellent question. Is this space collaborative or competitive?
Yes.
The truth is, frankly, that mankind rarely proceeds unless things are slightly competitive. So a little bit of competition is always a good thing. And I think that there can be quite a bit of competition at the technical supply level. I think there will be quite a lot of competition with existing central third parties who are going to see this as challenging, and perhaps rightly ought to. But it is probably the case that the leading edge of the business and organizational applications has to be collaborative, because you're trying to work with other organizations. If you're not trying to work with other organizations, you don't need a multi-organizational database. If you don't need a multi-organizational database, you don't need distributed ledgers or blockchains. So this, I think, is the fundamental approach that we take here. It's got to be broadly much more collaborative than any other than other types of technology projects, maybe not all other.
So what do we need for a wide adoption of blockchain and distributed ledger technology?
I don't think we need anything. I think it's proceeding apace. I believe blockchain and distributed ledger technology, because of the big step that it is in terms of taking a long-term solution to problems, needs to be thought through. So I like the fact that it is proceeding apace, so to speak, and I like the fact that people are spending some time learning about it. I think they should take that metaphor a lot further. We need to learn. We have all of the existing infrastructure, certainly for the current stage of technology, so that's not a big thing. We've got networks and servers and the internet and mobile phones and artificial intelligence, everything's there. So it's just letting it come out very, very, very safely. And I think in the two areas that we're most excited about, one is, as I said earlier, in identity systems. I think that will help to encourage real widespread adoption. That's the identity of people, but it's also the identity of assets like a ship or an automobile or a commercial lorry. It's also the identity of an organization. Why can't you have an identity chain, as we call it, for all the legal records, all of your health certificates, all of your insurance certificates, all of your inspections that you can hand over to a new owner of a business, for example. So that's the identity area. Then I think in the areas where people are incurring lots of costs in multi-party secure document transmission, validated document transmission, like shipping and insurance, we'll see widespread adoption. So although at the moment it seems to be very payments focused, and we'll have widespread adoption when we have payments, and maybe we will be paying on blockchains in the near future. The big revolution is going to be for us this area of identity and widespread documents. I might add one thing to that, if I might, just, and that's that people often say, well, blockchain, isn't it absolutely fantastic? And when are we going to have widespread adoption? I think there's another way to look at it. If I said to you, well, I've got a mobile phone here. Yes. Somebody said to you, I've got this mobile phone. By the way, I've got an app on here. It has all of the ski resorts in the world. And by the way, watch this. I'm now going to sort them by elevation. You wouldn't say to me, how did you do that, Michael? Did you do that using a database? It would be almost ludicrous, wouldn't it? And I think we'll be in the future saying something like, here's one of our identity systems. I can show you an identity system that we have here, and you want to look at it. Here's somebody's identity. And you're not going to look at that and say, how did you do that? Did you use a distributed ledger? And I think that's kind of when we know widespread adoption has actually arrived, when people aren't looking at the distributed ledger underneath. They're going to be looking at, wow, that's great. I can get identity documents and all that. They won't care how it's done.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.